Hey, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I work at IE Business School Publishing, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Do you have something you'd like some help with? Ask our guests. Go to professorgame.com/question and get your question answered in a future episode. Engagers, today we have David Chandross, who has very exciting things to tell us today. But before we get started, David, are you prepared to engage?
Yes.
Let's go. David he began his career as a neuroscientist working in the field of selective attention and cognitive science. After getting his Ph.D. in curriculum and second master's degree in medical education, he went on to become an academic dean and then held positions in senior administration across Canada in higher education. His work in gamification began in the 1990s and matured at Ryerson University, after which he accepted a position at the Simon Fraser University in the field of gamification under a 5-year, $3 million simulation and advanced gaming environments federal grant. He's currently holding the position of program coordinator with Ryerson University and participates in research initiatives in gamification with Baycrest Health Sciences, the College of Family Physicians, the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Toronto, and other institutions to further the implementation of game-based learning in higher education. So lots of exciting stuff here going on in the game-based, gamification, simulation fields, David. Is there anything that we left out that you might want to point out for the engagers?
No, but it's going to be hard to live up to that intro.
It sure is, but it's all definitely true, engagers. So the first thing that we'd like to get into, David, after an awesome introduction, getting to know how awesome you are, is to bring you a bit back into the ground and know what does a regular day with this awesome David Chandross look like, or maybe a regular week if a day is not so common.
Well, a good deal of what I do has been, I started out in this sort of, I've kind of full circle. I started out bringing game-based elements into my courses in the 1990s and eventually converted in the early 2000s all of my courses. These are university requisite courses that you have to take in medical physiology. And I converted all my courses to full games, full role-playing immersive games. And then when I went off to Simon Fraser, I stopped for many years and worked in the area of research on determining whether learning could happen through games, whether it was the same or equivalent or less than traditional learning, etc. And that took us into some interesting areas, including seniors education. So now I've sort of returned back. I'm still conducting a lot of research, but we're also trying to see this implemented in the university and college system. So what that would consist of is developing methods to introduce into colleges and universities by which faculty can begin to either use a game as a single part of a course or to convert their courses to games. So that is this very slow, frustratingly plodding process as things are. These colleges have 30,000 to 70,000 students, and there are numerous institutional barriers to innovation. So a lot of what I do is diffuse institutional innovation barriers. It's curricular sclerosis is the term I like to use. And the way I generally work is I would be meeting with faculty members. We would offer workshops on gamification. There's a lot of interest. People love it. They would come to these workshops, and then we would use design processes that people like Juno Harari and others have, Hamari rather, and others have been working out of how do you get someone who really is not a game designer to somehow create an interesting and compelling game experience in the classroom. So that involves a lot of hand-holding, mentoring, coaching, buddy systems. So that's a good deal of the work is addressing these kind of issues.
Very, very interesting days that you have, I have to say, David. And once again, it's important, especially for those people who are out there thinking that this is something very cool to do, but then they look at people like yourself, like many other experts that have been doing this for years, and say, well, but that's too far off. That's super difficult. I mean, they're already there. They're already experts. And that's why we like to show also the other side. And we would like to know if you have a story that you can tell us about a time in which you were trying to implement one of these strategies and simulations, game-based learning, etc., in which things didn't go the way you expected. It just basically went south, and you had some fail.
There's a lot of south that happens, but I tend to remember my successes more than my failures. Let's better for your LinkedIn profile too. Let me think about a case that really went south on it. I think one of the most recent things that went south is I was a visiting academic or professor at Humber College, which is a pretty large college here in Canada. It's the biggest community college in Canada. It has something like 50 or 60,000 students. And I was brought in as the first hired professor in Canada who specifically is there for serious game design and in education. And it was a 1 year, limited term appointment. And we got a lot of things going. Like we wrote literature reviews, we got tons of faculty, we have projects that are still going now. And then they launched this new strategic plan that they've been working on. And the way colleges do strategic plans is they don't really tell anyone about it. They just kind of make a big plan, and then they say, okay, here's the plan. And this plan included nothing having to do with game-based learning. The vice president academic who hired me is an incredibly forward, innovative thinker, Eileen DeCourcy. She's incredible. Well, she went on to accept a position at another college, a higher position. So that means the vice president who was supporting this went. And when it did, she brought the proposal to keep this initiative going to her new VP, who just looked at her dumbfoundedly and says, I don't know what gamification is. I never heard of this stuff. And I don't want to spend any money on it because I don't know what it is. So the whole thing just stopped. And fortunately, there's several projects that didn't stop that we have funded that are moving along. But that's the kind of thing that makes you want to give up and do something else. But you got to dust yourself off and say, look, we made some change. But it's this thing where organizations dip their foot in the water, and then when the rubber hits the road, they run back to what they kind of learned, which for them is lecture and labs. I mean, that's the way they see the world. So that would be an example of a failure.
A setback that you had. And just looking back, David, in that sense, would there be something that you would do differently? Because I think it's a very interesting experience that you had and that many might run into if they're into higher education as well and trying to implement gamification. Yeah. Is there anything that you would try to do differently or approach differently to get a different result?
In this case, it's hard because the vice president took another job that she didn't even know she was going to get. When she was going to renew for this year, in fact, she said she still wants to take it to the next stage. And we had this team. We have a laser scanner at Humber. It's a $100,000 device. And with laser scans, Robert, you can scan the outside of a building and it'll give you a three-dimensional image of the building. So then you can create characters and games and put them in the building. So we were all set to scan it. And the other thing that impacted this is that we had a change of government in Ontario. And the government is sort of anti-education. They're kind of weird and very right-wing. And they don't believe education is all that good. They think it's kind of overblown fluff. And the people just need jobs, 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 without thinking about the bigger issues. So they immediately cut millions of dollars of funding from the system that had been appointed by the old government. So this entire team of laser scanners and video game designers that took us 6 months of painstaking work, we found out we lost $500,000 in funding overnight. So you can't really do things about that. You've got this. The colleges and universities are weird places to work. That's why gamification is doing very well in the private sector. It's incredible. Bloomingdale's and major companies like the Bay here in Canada, and I could go on. The UN, whatever, they're all using it. But colleges and universities are very, very stuck, and they're very siloed, which means there are many departments, and they all don't talk to each other, and they compete with each other. They don't really work together all that well. And then the government funding is what a lot of them rely on here in Canada, and when that funding formula changes. So there's not much you can do about that other than do what I've done, which is try to sow the seeds. And along the way, let me tell you one success, several successes that came out of Humber.
That's the next question. So we could jump perfectly into the success, which is more enjoyable in many ways.
Well, yeah, but I think this dealing with the obstacles we face is needed in the field because there's a lot of rah 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 about the process itself, which we all love. But how you actually get this thing moving is, I think, where we need the most research right now to understand that. So, good successes there. As we speak, we have converted the learning management system into a game. And you do that using adaptive release. That is, that in all LMSs, you have this ability, no matter how crappy the LMS is, to not be able to do X till you've done Y. So you have to do this module. When you do, it unlocks the next one. Well, that's how games work. That's how a lot of immersive games work. You go on a quest, which then opens another quest. So right now, we've got a whole gamified neurological assessment game going, in which students log onto Blackboard. They play the game. They can work together if they want. They go into a waiting room. There's a series of cases, and they can choose the case they want. And each stage of the case, it starts with a patient. You have to make a decision. Once you make a decision, the next part of the case opens. And they're doing that with hundreds of students now. So that is a really powerful kind of win despite that. So again, by working directly with the faculty and the end user, not the end user, but the trainer, we can overcome some of these limitations in institutions because trainers or faculty have a fair amount of latitude about how they want to teach. The other thing I would say is working with end users.
A small pause there, David, because
please.
there I had a question. You're mentioning that the LMS, you're blocking things so that they don't see them yet. Is it kind of scenario based? What you're talking about?
Yeah, it's a scenario. So it's a waiting room full of patients with names with their main complaint. So one of them, his name is Susan, who has bruises. Susan's with bruises. So you got to figure out what the story is. And at first, it indicates that there's some domestic abuse going on. The bruises on her arms. She's kind of furtive when she's answering. The case starts an opening as you do it. Well, it turns out as you go through the case, and it's all on a timer, stage by stage, that she has a clotting disorder in the liver, and that's causing the bruising. So there's simulations that unlock piece by piece as you solve each part of the case.
Very, very interesting example, and something that we could learn a lot from it, because this is from the medical sector. It sounds kind of obvious that you can use these kinds of things. But you can use it in many other things. You can use it in engineering with projects. You can use it in business, again, with projects and budgets and things. I mean, I'm sure that there's many ways, depending on your field, that you could think about how this can play out. If it's literature, it could be different parts of the story. And there's many things that I think could be played out through this strategy, which I think is fantastic, though. So thanks for that. You wanted to mention something else, David?
Well, no, I think that's the main point. I think getting that point across was the key. But yeah, it's this whole process of taking something like Blackboard or Moodle or D2L or whatever platform, edX, whatever you're using, and using that little feature called adaptive release. The other thing that we've done a lot of games on WordPress blogs, like you just need a discussion forum. And we did this with an insurance course at Humber. And I'm actually addressing the Insurance Institute of Canada next week, who are all the top insurance people. And teaching insurance, as you could imagine, is not the most exciting thing you could do. I mean, with all due respect, how interesting is it really? But we were able to produce a game. And the game is this thing where each week on the discussion board, we put up some case studies, 3 cases a week. And each one is worth, let's say, $100 gold or $100 when you complete it. You only have to do one to unlock the next stage. But you can go back and farm the others, as it were, to get more gold. And the cases are simple ones. A 24-year-old motorcyclist is needing insurance for the first time. What do you kind of do? Are there any considerations that have to do with its age of the motorcycle? And then another case could be someone is making an insurance claim for theft in their building, but they can't show any damage to their locker. You're just kind of taking their word for it that someone broke in and stole a bicycle, but you don't have no proof of it. So how do you deal with that? Well, when you deal with that, then the next week in the course, it unlocks number 2. That's another 3 set of cases. These ones are a little tougher. So the cases get tougher and tougher as you go through the course, and eventually you unlock things. So in the course, if you get a certain amount of gold, let's say 300 gold, you can buy something like a Learjet. I'm just making this up. There were better things, more reasonable things you could buy, like an office assistant or like a marketing person. So you spend your $300 you earned in the game on a Learjet. Well, now the Learjet, because you have it, it unlocks a whole new series of cases that pay $10,000 each. So you do things in the game, you get money, you have to be able to buy things with the money, and then you use the things to improve your learning in the course. And this involves personalization of learning. It's really powerful, and we piloted this for years at different universities.
Seems to be working beautifully.
Yeah, and it's easy to do.
Fantastic, fantastic. So, David, you have all these things that you've done, and I'm sure that there's some approach that you have when you're trying to solve one of these problems, or you're trying to overhaul a class that has been taught the traditional way, and somebody comes up and says, "David, let's gamify this. Let's turn this into a game." What do you do when you approach a situation? Do you have some sort of process, some sort of steps, some approach? How do you confront these situations?
You are asking just fabulous questions. Really good interview, I got to say, because you're getting at the things that we need to look at the most in this field now, I think. There's a lot of different approaches. Let's just kind of divide them into two things to keep things simple. One is an ideational strategy, and that is where I become the architect of the game using their content, working with them for input. So I could decide, okay, we're going to make this game about building an empire. We did this for a game in human resources at another college. They wanted to onboard faculty and they wanted to onboard new hires. So we had a whole building game where they had to build this little city called Leviathan. And they had to buy things. And the more things they did in the learning, the more things they could buy. And when they bought things, you could put them in combinations. So if you had a church plus a granary, plus, let's say an armory, that could earn you this amount of money per day. So you build the city in a strategic way. And they liked the idea, and then they worked with me to think of cool ways to implement it. So that's an ideational strategy where I kind of come in and design with them. The other approach is where we try to present some ideas about games that we've used in the past and see which of those ideas they like, and then have them kind of design jam that and say, all right, what do you think would be a good way to make a game of this? Why don't you think of some ideas and let's talk at it next week? The other variation of that, the sort of B version of that, is I go directly to the students and I bypass the faculty altogether. Muhaha. This is very cool. So I locate students in courses, and we did this one course for psychology. Students have a hell of a time learning statistics. They have a hell of a time with brain anatomy. There's some other things that are really tough, and they're taught in maybe a lecture or two, and then you're tested. And how can you, statistics can kill people. It's such a hard subject. So they were psychology students. So I went to them and I said, okay, folks, here's what I want you to do. And it's what I would do with faculty too, Robert. Write down 5 things in the course right now that either you, A, wish you had more practice doing, or B, had a hard time learning. Just 5. So the students quickly identified the 5 areas, and then we started to build a game with them, suggesting different ideas to sort of address those. And then I took the idea to the faculty member eventually when the game was built, and I said, well, we built this game with your students, and I don't want to usurp you, but they were so interested. Are you interested in getting involved in this? We'd really love to have your help, and maybe you could try it in your class. And they liked that. And then she said, well, I don't really like this. I want to use this game right now, but here's what I'm going to do. I teach a course in the psychology of learning. So now I'm going to make an assignment worth 20% of their grade, which they have to build a learning game about the course content. So they have to make a game to get 20% of their final grade. And so wild things happen once you start. You don't know where you're going to start with this, but that's this idea of a collaborative versus an ideational strategy. The third strategy, I guess, that I would add as I think about it is one where they themselves just come up with an idea. We did a game in addiction medicine that was funded by the College of Family Physicians for teenagers, for adolescents with, believe it or not, they're like 16 and they're doing 4 grams of cocaine intravenous a day. There's some heavy addiction in Canada. So one of the doctors plays Zombie Run. It's part of her workout. She's got this little app on her phone. So she said, I got a good idea for a game. Why don't we put them all in caves underground, imprisoned by their addiction, and they have to somehow get out of the cave to the surface of the land to rebuild their life. And that they're held in the caves by kind of a drug or a noxious substance called D. So I said, well, D is pretty obvious. It's an acronym for, code name for drug. Why don't we make it a more of an interesting story? So there's a case where so what you have is high imagination users will make their own games in that case.
Okay, that sounds very, very, very interesting of approaches. So you have three approaches that David has mentioned. If you want to catch up with them again, you feel free to go back to the start of these because they're very, very interesting and very, very deep. They're general approaches. You can always say, well, I can sit down and sit by myself and design this game. I can sit down with my students and design something for the class so that they create the game. So there's many ways that you could be approaching this, and that's very, very interesting, David.
Yeah, it's kind of in colleges, it's kind of a subversive victory because you go right to the students, and the students have a lot of power in colleges now. They really listen to them. So if the students want it, then the faculty member feels, well, okay, if they like it, maybe the class will like it. And then you have to be nice because one wrong word in academia, people have very thin skins. You have an enemy for life. And I imagine it's true in a lot of businesses. The soft skills of how you come in and bring gamification on board. This is where people like Michael Van Unen, I noticed that you interviewed Karen Sakima last week.
Yes.
These people have amazing people skills. And I think that's why people like Andrej and other great folks in this field are successful. Monica Carnetti, we could go on. Because they're really good with people and they know how to understand how weird this must seem to someone and how much support they need in exploring it.
Yes, indeed. That's a very important consideration that we need to have when designing gamification for somebody, that the resistance could be a very important element. So how you approach it is very important. That's why I was very interested in your initial experience where you had some pushback, because maybe you thought of something that could be a solution. But this is something ongoing that happens to everybody at some point in gamification. The question is, how do we learn from that experience and how do we move on to the next? Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. I always go into this second part of the interview. This is sort of a different jazz from before. We had these stories, these processes, all these things that were very, very interesting. But now we're going for something a little bit different. In a way, it's more of a rapid fire kind of questions, just to get a feel of things that could be interesting from your perspective. So the first thing is if there's anything that you would call sort of maybe a best practice or something that you say, well, when you think about this and when you use these strategies or these elements, it's something that almost any gamification project could benefit from doing in general.
Buddy systems, really powerful. Become somebody's buddy or a team faculty up with students or with each other. Have a buddy system to bounce ideas off of.
That's fantastic. Very interesting idea. The social aspect of interacting with other people is always super important.
Yeah, that you build upon each ideas and you form a little team. We had one project which we've called 4 Jews Go to Prison. Now, before I sound like some horrible person, I'm Jewish and these other 3 people are Jewish. And we didn't call it that originally. It's kind of a joke. We were interested in, one of them was a social worker who works in one of the worst jails in Canada, the South Toronto Detention Center. It's kind of a horror show in there. People are in there awaiting further sentencing. So some are in there for 2 years, some are in there for 6 months, some a few weeks. And it's a miserable place with fighting and deaths and stabbings you would not believe. So she came to us and said, can we gamify pre-release? Can we gamify it so that prisoners have something to do? Because all they do all day is play poker or shoot basketball or, they go nuts from boredom. So is there something they can do in a game that would get them ready for when they're released, they can have a better life and not be addicted and not have these troubles? So I contacted my good colleague, Dr. Alan Kalpin, who's an addiction medicine specialist and psychotherapist. We've worked together before in addiction medicine games. So he said, I'm in, this sounds great. So now we have an addiction and a doctor in on it. Then we got a hold of this mathematician who was a game designer, and he loved the idea. And then there was one other person who, I'll remember it in a second. But then at one point in it, that's 4 of us. Yeah, the game designer, Alan, me, working on it, and then the social worker. And then the last names kept sounding kind of Jewish. And we said, are you Jewish by any chance? He said, yeah, I am. And we found out we were all Jewish, just as a joke. So that's when it got called 4 Jews Go to Prison. So this is the idea that you can take a little thing like that, build a little team of buddies, and then we decided at the end of it, we would need about 4 games for prison. We would have a modified version of poker in which you could only do things in the card game as you learn things or, learn something about how to get a job. Like, what are you going to do when you get out? What is your strategy for getting a job? And then another game was for the basketball players. So the idea is that it was fitness oriented. The more fitness and physical activities you did, the more you got in the game, and you got challenges like shooting 20 successful hoop shots from 10 yards away, then going 20 yards away and shooting good hoop shots. And then we have the tough guys. And these are guys who are all about hierarchy, who's in charge. And so for them, we developed this Dungeons and Dragons type game where there's an adventure and they go and they can kill things and they get shields and weapons. But they're in a simulated world where they're killing ignorance, they're killing depression, they're killing stupidity. So out of that, these social interactions comes this rich tapestry of game designs in an area that nobody's done much work in.
Yeah, getting people involved and involving other people, getting different ideas. That's a fantastic idea. And in that sense, precisely of games, what would you say, David, is your favorite game?
That I play? Well, I'm sort of sad to share that I still play World of Warcraft every day for at least 2 hours at night before I go to bed.
Why are you sad about that?
Well, because World of Warcraft is just so commonly cited as an example, and really there are thousands of incredible games out there. But World of Warcraft is a place where I'm playing the part. I have different characters I have, and I'm write this kind of female priest called Illusioness, and she heals the wounded, and it's just kind of role-playing, and it's very wonderful. And the other thing about World of Warcraft is there's no race, there's no color, there's no religion, there's no age. There was someone in our guild who's black, and I had no idea she was that, For all these years we played together, there is no black, there is no white, there is no religion. When you're in an online game like that, you're just who you are. And for me, that would be a better world anyhow. So I think something about World of Warcraft is just so complete. It's such a nice experience. But in my own research at Simon Fraser, another game I always point people to look at is Deus Ex. And I interviewed the lead designer for Deus Ex, which is rated as one of the top 10 video games of all time, still to this date, because based on your moral choices in the game, different parts of the game would unlock. So if you made bad moral choices, this was Peter Molyneux's game, Black and White, but then eventually in Fable, where your character got uglier and uglier the more horrible it was in the game. So these kind of ability to be something who you're not in this world, I'm kind of going to cold myself here because I could go on with examples. We've done stuff with seniors, for example. We put them in Second Life. They have dementia, but in Second Life, it's an open world game. You can just do whatever you want. You fly around. Well, they loved it, and they were furious when we stopped the game because in real life, they're in a wheelchair with dementia. But in the game, they could be anyone they wanted. And this stuff makes my heart really warm and makes me feel that we're really doing the right thing, Robert. We're doing something much deeper than training and development. We're really on the development edge here in many cases.
That's beautiful, David. And what would you say is somebody that you would like to listen to interviewed in an interview like this one?
I would say don't give up and despair, because if the good people quit, then nothing happens. You got to be persistent and just stick with it. And also sort of a plug, I'm writing a book right now, and a plug for a new way to maybe interpret this whole field. And the book is about what I call autopoietic hyperreality. So those are two new words for your listeners. Autopoiesis comes from self-organizing systems theory that Ilya Prigogine got a Nobel Prize for in 1974. And this is the idea that very complex systems can self-organize. So people that you're training, groups of people, you have no idea what they're going to learn and where they're going to know when you teach them. So don't put them in a box. You have no idea that if you make the learning open enough and the game open enough, what people will stumble into and create. The hyperreality points to this fact that we are now moving into hyperreality, which is we're not going to deal with the real world as much as we're going to deal with a simulated world. We're going to be wearing little goggles, and we're going to have biosensors that tell us our heart rate and our blood cholesterol levels. We're going to have little goggles that as we shop will tell us which stores have sales and will give us experience points when we walk instead of taking a cab. So hyperreality is this new phase. So we're moving into a new digital phase where a lot of our reality is going to be online, like you and I today. We've never met each other and wouldn't recognize each other, probably in a crowd. But we're very connected, Robert, and I'm connected to your listeners, I hope.
Yes. We hope you are, and that's great advice. And what the plug is completely welcome. I always like to leave some time as well to let us know what you're working on. But
Yeah.
I would like to know, who would you like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game? Is there a person you would like to listen to in an interview like this one?
Yeah, there's people that aren't a part of the gamification guru community that are doing the best work in the world in research, and they're just not in that field. David Kaufman from Simon Fraser University is one of the best in the world, and hardly nobody knows about him. And he's the one that held that $3 million grant with 14 universities participating. David Kaufman at Simon Fraser is remarkable.
Fantastic. That's a fantastic recommendation. And in that same line, is there, aside of course from the book, from your book that you just mentioned, is there any other book that you would recommend our listeners to read?
Oh man, there's so many that are coming out right now. I mean, I hate to be boring and retro, but Carl Kapp's books, I mean, you've got to include them. If you do a lit review, it pretty well starts with Carl Kapp.
Fantastic. That's a great recommendation. He's actually a past guest as well. I
Yeah.
don't remember the number of the episode right now, but I could probably find it right here on the webpage.
Yeah, I would say Carl Kapp, and then of course Andrzej Marczowski's book on ninja monkeys is a way, and his work on hex ads is a very nice way if you don't want to be all academic about it. I think Andrzej writes is sort of a man of his times. He is able to reflect what's going on in the field in a way that's very accessible, and he's a very smart, well-educated guy and a close colleague. We all love him very much.
Yes, indeed. He was episode 30, and we have Carl Kapp. I just found him as well, episode 25. So if any of the engagers wants to go back and that hasn't listened or wants to repeat those two guests, which were absolutely amazing as well, you can go back to the episodes 25 and 30, which are Carl Kapp and Andrzej Marczewski.
There's one more thing I'd add. David Kaufman
Yes.
did produce a book on just look for Kaufman and Sauvé, Sauve, Louis Sauvé. And just, I can't remember the exact title, but just put David Kaufman, Louis Sauvé, lessons learned, and you'll find it. They produced a whole book that is a summary of the $3 million grant. And it has a series of chapters, each written by specialists. It's essential reading if you're going to gamify for medical or higher education. It's an incredible book.
Fantastic. That's also a great recommendation, especially because we're very, very interested in what's going on in education. I am personally involved in higher education as well, so it's very, very interesting recommendation that you're giving us. And David, what would you say is your superpower here in the gamification world?
Synthetic thinking, creative thinking. My background is philosophy and neuroscience. So I tend to look at things in a unique way, looking at archetypes, looking at Homer's Iliad, looking at the work of Aristotle on eudaimonia, which is a state of flourishing in life. So I think what I bring to it is that my background is philosophy and neuroscience. So that gives me a very peculiar angle on things. It's sort of storytelling, but I aim for what's called semiotic resonance, which means your avatar in the game should represent your real process in life, and that the game should put you through what life puts you through on a fairly deep level. Everything from anti-racism training to caring for each other. That, to me, learning isn't about making more money for the company. It's about the company being a place that is so delightful to work at that people want to stay, they want to be creative, and they build wonderful products because people are open and accepted. So I see a bigger vision to gamification, and I think that's probably an influence I'm trying to have in the field.
Fantastic, and a very welcome influence as well. David, we're arriving to the end of the interview, but we would like to know if there's any final piece of advice. You have given a lot of fantastic advice, but if there's anything else you would like to add, then let us know where we can connect with you, and then we'll say it's game over.
Yeah. Well, you can reach me at dchandross at ryerson.ca, Ryerson. That's the name of our university, ryerson.ca. You can reach me by email, and I'm happy to help. You can also find me at LinkedIn, of course, under my name. And anything I can do, I'm always happy to support other people on the journey with me.
Fantastic. Any piece of advice you want to leave us with as well?
Think big. Think really, really big. Think about your soul. And I don't mean in a religious way. I mean in a Sam Harris way. Kind of think about, why are you building games at all? And if there's not a really profound reason for you, you probably won't last because you're going to be hammered. And I mean hammered. So you've got to have some source of strength that knows you're doing the right thing, not just to help the local tire company sell more widgets, but that you're going to make the world a better place through it. And if we're coming from that altruistic place, my father taught business, and that's what he taught, altruism in business. The more we look after each other and take care of each other, the better businesses thrive. It's a direct relationship.
Wow, that's a very, very inspiring final piece of advice. Thank you for that, David. Now we know we can find you in LinkedIn and at your email. But for now, at least for this interview, it's time for us to say it's game over.
Thank you, Robert, for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for coming. Hey, Engagers. Thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast. If you want more details of this interview with David Chandross, you can go to professorgame.com/podcast/058 because this is episode 58. There you can also subscribe, and that way we can be in contact and you will have exclusive access to opportunities that Professor Game might have for you. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know Naomi Pariseau, one of the winners of the GameCon Awards in Chicago this year, and her project? Then subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there!